During a 1958 mapping expedition, a Soviet team was trekking from the coast across the interior of the eastern half of the Antarctic and detonating explosives every 100 miles to measure the thickness of the ice. In the middle of the East Antarctic ice sheet, the team was traveling across ice 2 miles thick when something strange started to happen, according to Robin Bell, a geophysicist and professor at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. They suddenly found this very thin ice in the middle of the ice sheet. One of the team shouted, "There are mountains here, big mountains." The team had stumbled upon what were later dubbed as the Gamburtsev Mountains, a range of steep peaks that rise to 3,000 meters and stretch 1,200 kilometers across the interior of the continent. Bell, who had studied the area for years, said, "It's really hard to imagine that there are mountains under there. It doesn't matter which way you spin, it's pretty flat." Yet, she added, the truly mysterious part of the hidden mountains is not that they exist, but how they still exist. The inexorable march of geological time erodes mountains away. If we came back in 100 million years, the Alps would be gone. The Gamburtsev Mountains, at the ripe old age of 900 million to a billion years old, should have been worn down eons ago. However, recent research indicates the mountains are a kind of geological anomaly. They were born a long time ago, but it seems somewhere between 100 and 200 million years ago, they had a renaissance. Bell's theory proposed it happened during a rifting event, when tectonic forces were wresting apart continental masses during the breakup of Gondwana, the ancient supercontinent. At the time, the eroded mountain's heavy roots apparently underwent a density change which buoyed the mountain range back up. Exactly how that change in the Gamburtsev's root happens is a mystery. This has had geologists scratching their heads since its discovery. In among the Gamburtsev Mountains lies another, even more mysterious feature of the Antarctic, Lake Vostok, a pristine freshwater lake buried beneath 3.7 kilometers of solid ice. In recent times, a series of mysterious reports have been coming out of this area, centered around a strange anomaly detected under the ice. The stories draw eerie parallels to materials such as the French novel Subterranean. First, a little background on Vostok. In 1957, the Russians built a base in eastern Antarctica, which they named Vostok, which also happens to be the name of the first series of manned Russian spacecraft. In the 1970s, via airborne radar surveys, they belatedly began to suspect that they had inadvertently, as the story goes, built their base at the tip of a large subglacial lake. In the years since, orbital radar mapping combined with surface seismological measurements have confirmed that Lake Vostok, under over 2 miles of solid ice, is the largest lake discovered in the last 100 years, roughly the size of Lake Ontario, but much deeper in places, more than 3,000 feet, or about 1,000 meters, with about 4 times the volume. The lake, which is still liquid and not frozen, has been isolated under the ice sheet since anywhere from 13,000 to 14 million years ago, depending on who you talk to. The water in the lake, determined by surface thermal scans, ranges from 50 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, clearly indicating a subterranean heat source. In addition, the whole lake is covered by a sloping air dome several thousand feet high that's formed from the hot water melting the overlying ice just above the lake's surface. Core samples taken by the Russians a couple decades ago at their Vostok base, when they drilled down very close to the bottom of the ice sheet, have revealed the presence of microbes, nutrients, and various gases, like methane, embedded in the clear, refrozen lake water just above the dome. Such items are typical signatures of biological processes. The lake, therefore, had all the ingredients of an incredible scientific find, a completely isolated ecosystem. Water, heat, respired gases, and current biological activity. As the actual scope and composition of the lake became clear from about 1998 on, NASA began to see it as an ideal test bed for its eventual plans to drill through the ice and search the oceans of Jupiter's moon, Europa. Accordingly, JPL received NASA grants to develop unique sterile drilling technology, conduct drilling and probe experiments in other terrestrial environments, and to prepare a plan to actually enter Lake Vostok by 2002. But coincidentally, with a stunning new discovery, JPL backed off these ambitious exploration plans. According to Scientific American, the National Science Foundation suddenly canceled plans to penetrate the lake with a robotic probe by that target date. The ostensible reason was concern over environmental contamination. As noted earlier, core samples returned from the ice refrozen just 100 yards above the lake's air dome contained a plethora of microorganisms of various categories, including some never seen before. These new exotic life forms raised concerns among the environmental lobby that exploration of Lake Vostok might contaminate an otherwise pristine ecosystem. All this seems quite reasonable until you factor in what happened next and the reaction to it. A team of scientists from Columbia University, working under the auspices of the National Science Foundation, began a series of unprecedented low-altitude aerial surveys over Lake Vostok, designed to chart gravitational, magnetic, and thermal activity under the ice. During doing so, they made a stunning find. A huge magnetic anomaly was discovered covering the entire southeast portion of the shore of the lake. This remarkable anomaly could not have, of course, been caused by natural processes. One implausible possibility, voiced by Columbia's Michael Studinger, is that the Earth's crust near the lake is simply thinner under this section of the Antarctic, having been stretched during the formation of the lake bed itself. This, according to Studinger, would result in a local magnetic anomaly. Geologist Ron Nix had serious difficulty with this theory. Nix explained that such a thinning would heat the underlying rock and thus diminish, rather than increase as observed, the crust's ability to locally amplify the Earth's magnetic field. There is, as always, an equally viable alternative explanation. An anomaly like this could also be caused by an accumulation of metals, the kind you'd get if you found the remains of an ancient, buried spaceship. An ancient landing site of an alien craft? Such a discovery would be absolutely dazzling, sending shockwaves through our world as profound as the discovery of artifacts on Mars or ruins on the moon. The notion of an alien landing site is not as improbable as you may think and can be linked to Atlantis, which has often been connected to the inexplicable advancement of ancient technology. Where did they get this technology from? There's a growing trend toward the acceptance of the notion of catastrophism as a viable alternative to conventional geologic models. This is in opposition to the current geological model called gradualism, the concept that geologic changes only happen slowly over eons. However, more and more evidence is mounted from the Vostok ice cores, for example, that climatological changes can happen rapidly. Some attribute these catastrophic changes in the record to sudden polar shifts. Many researchers from a variety of evidence have put the last such sudden shift at around 13,000 years ago. Under this catastrophic model, Antarctica might well have been a temperate, even a jungle continent, as recently as that 13,000-year time frame. A sudden change in the Earth's alignment relative to the Sun would have plunged this once hospitable land into a perpetual freezing hell, as cold as Mars in some places. Indeed, it's easy to see Antarctica as the source of worldwide Atlantis legends we've all heard and read. According to at least one source, Dr. Werner von Braun of NASA was convinced that Atlantis is below the ice. This admittedly far-fetched notion, however, begins to take on an air of viability in the extraordinary content of recent discoveries. Almost immediately after the discovery of the Columbia Vostok magnetic anomaly, word began to leak that JPL was inexplicably pulling back from its Vostok exploration program. The reason given was the previously stated environmental concerns. This was all well and good, until unconfirmed reports began to surface that a JPL spokesperson had admitted at a February press conference that the National Security Agency had literally taken over the JPL Polar Research Program at Lake Vostok. It was this report which created something of a firestorm on the internet. Several sources immediately pointed to the fact that the location of the Vostok anomaly is quite close to the coordinates shown in the X-Files movie regarding the fictional location of a massive buried alien spacecraft. In fact, the Russian Vostok base is the closest base of any kind of the coordinates given in the movie. All this may remind you, of course, of many researchers' previous suspicions about the true source of some X-Files creator Chris Carter's story ideas. The discovery of the peculiar Vostok anomaly underneath the ice, encompassing an area almost 3,000 miles in area, was also eerily reminiscent of a French novel, Subterranean, in which Antarctic scientists discover an inhabited lost city under the ice. There were even stranger stories suddenly coming from the bottom of the world in this time frame. A report by NPR stated that someone at McMurdo had become disoriented and began to spread the rumor of an ancient UFO landing in Antarctica. There was even a poster circulating through the base, depicting a giant spacecraft hovering directly over McMurdo. The individual supposedly responsible was promptly deported from the continent, literally put on the next plane back to New Zealand. Equally bizarre, at least 3 scientists, including the Russian discoverer of a remarkable set of geometric dunes seen directly over the strongest region of the Vostok anomaly, have died on the continent within 2 years of the discovery. Curiously, the causes of these deaths, all of them young men in their 30s and 40s, have not been reported. Whether the story about the JPL press conference is in fact the truth, still stranger things began to happen down south. Initially, it was reported that the doctor at the South Pole, the second replacement in 2 years at the Amundsen Scott base, needed an unprecedented airlift extraction because of complications from a gallstone. Then, coincidentally with that, other reports began to surface of the need for 4 more medical extractions in an equally unprecedented fashion from the coastal base at McMurdo Station, the largest U.S. base on the entire continent. Again, as with the previously reported deaths, the reasons were somewhat mysterious as to the precise need for these emergency medical extractions. Public speculation is hinged on the idea that someone coming into McMurdo from New Zealand brought something with them from home, infectious disease that was subsequently spreading among the isolated population there. However, this is extremely unlikely, precisely because of the isolated population in Antarctica. Immigrants are screened for a wide range of diseases before being allowed on the continent. In fact, upon arrival, they're quarantined for several days to ensure they've not brought any friends from home with them. And as is well known, the environmental conditions in Antarctica are so harsh that normal viruses and other microbial life cannot readily survive. Even common colds are vanishingly rare, virtually guaranteeing that nobody in this instance caught a case of the Antarctic flu. So, what happened? 2 thoughts immediately spring to mind. One is that some special project had, against all scientific and environmental prudence, indeed drilled through the ice into the Lake Vostok ecosystem, clandestinely of course, and the participants have suddenly found themselves exposed to something for which their bodies literally have no immunity, something not extant in the rest of Earth's biosphere for between 13,000 and several million years. After the initial reports of 4 emergency extractions, the number changed to 5. And then 12 McMurdo personnel were supposedly in need of a dangerous emergency medical evacuation, well into the Antarctic winter season. At one level, this has all the earmarks of something virulently spreading among the limited winter population at the base, something that even the complete medical facilities at McMurdo could no longer cope with. Complicating the picture is the fact that the extractees were not research scientists or long-term support personnel, but were all employees of Raytheon Corporation, a high-tech firm that's deeply involved in a variety of black ops programs for the US government all around the world. This idea that the two simultaneous emergencies were due to some kind of black ops fiasco in Antarctica is reinforced by another little-noticed story that came out of the Amundsen Scott base that the doctor brought in to replace the ailing doctor was also asked to bring in an emergency supply of salt. She was even asked to stuff her own pockets full of salt packets, ostensibly because there's no room on the rescue aircraft itself. This was obviously a silly, thinly veiled cover story designed to tell someone outside something. Salt is crucial to survival in outdoor conditions in Antarctica. The air is so dry that unless someone exposed to the outdoors there has a good supply of salt, they're likely to face the possibility of death by mineral depletion and dehydration. Obviously, the base, after years of operation, would have a pretty good handle on just how much salt is needed until the next resupply plane arrives. So how is it that they suddenly find themselves desperately without any of it left? One of the first things to note is that the phrase filling your pockets with salt is actually a term commonly used in the nuclear industry. It refers to the practice of taking iodine pills to shield people's thyroids during a nuclear emergency. According to one source, fill your pockets with salt is industry lingo for pop the iodine pills, we're radioactive here. Now, in the absence of iodine pills, which would certainly not be available in any significant quantity in a nuclear-free zone like the Antarctic, the alternative would be to take large quantities of iodized salt. This would also explain the need for a sudden and unprecedented extraction of a dozen Raytheon Polar Service employees from the continent yesterday. Their illness could be directly related to radiation exposure. The question of the day, however, is what exactly could they have been exposed to, if they were exposed, that was radioactive? Under the terms of several international treaties to which the United States is a prime signatory, the Antarctic continent is a rigidly controlled nuclear-free zone. Even the reactor which used to power McMurdo Station was removed in 1993. There are not supposed to be any nuclear devices of any kind in Antarctica at all. One possibility that's been mentioned to explain this current highly anomalous situation is that if workers were able to drill through the ice to Lake Vostok itself, it could be that the source of internal heating in the lake is itself radioactive. However, radioactivity generated by such a process would be insufficient to cause radiation sickness in humans, certainly in a short time frame of mere months. The only viable explanation remaining for a case of radiation sickness is if a radioactive device was discovered under the ice. These Raytheon Black Ops personnel did indeed find something in their secret drilling under Vostok and needed to get it back to civilization as soon as possible for in-depth study. The whole idea of an outbreak was simply a ruse to cover the need for a large airplane dramatically visiting McMurdo at a time never attempted in all its years before. The only way out for something very important from the continent. How do you cover such an operation and cover up the fact that workers were suffering from radiation poisoning, which would have caused a major investigation in a supposedly nuclear-free zone? Put all the medical hints out there and wait for the internet researchers to figure out that there's been some kind of outbreak at McMurdo, all the while covering your real agenda, which is to get your hands on genuine alien bodies or artifacts before the dead of the Antarctic winter makes any such attempt that year impossible. The theory that this was a landing site for UFOs and that aliens continue to live underneath the ice remains one of the most popular theories about Antarctica in general and Lake Vostok in particular, especially because of the presence of the magnetic anomaly under the lake and because ALH 84001 was discovered in Antarctica during the 1984-1985 Antarctic summer. It was found by a team of meteorite hunters from the ANSMET program, which is sponsored by the Polar Programs Office of the U.S. National Science Foundation. ANSMET stands for Antarctic Search for Meteorites and was funded by the NSF. It's nearly certain that ALH 84001 is from Mars, even though people have never been to Mars and no rocks have ever been collected on Mars. In fact, there are 11 other meteorites called the SNCs that are also almost certain to be from Mars. The strongest evidence for their Martian origin is that they, including ALH 84001, contain traces of gas that's just like the Martian atmosphere. We know the composition of the Martian atmosphere because the Viking lander spacecraft analyzed it on Mars in 1976. The Martian atmosphere is different from the Earth's atmosphere or Venus or any other source of gas that's ever been found. To get off Mars and reach Earth, ALH 84001 would have to leave the Martian surface going faster than Mars' escape velocity, about 5 kilometers per second or 11,000 miles per hour, which is not the most plausible explanation. This leaves unanswered the questions of how this rock crossed 52 miles of space and arrived on Earth. Maybe a UFO landed on Mars and the rock became lodged in its landing gear. Later, as the saucer was making its final approach into an alien base in Antarctica, the rock came loose and landed in the ice field. In short, the rock came to Earth the same way that Dandelion came to North America, by ship. It's a far-fetched idea, but somehow Martian rock ended up on Earth near one of the most mysterious places on Earth. A mysterious whistleblower, known only as Wayne, explained the following, astonishingly, way back in 2001. Enough of the ice cap has melted in this region to allow for the emitting of a certain signal. Before there was ice, there was land, and there was a large landing port for extraterrestrial craft. The extraterrestrials put up something comparable to what you'd call an observatory. It contained a signaling device that could transmit frequencies in a coded pattern. Even after the ice cap began forming, at this end of the lake there was still an entrance way into the inner regions of the Earth. This inner region is now completely underground. Over the next several months, more and more bases like this will be discovered, and the various governments are going to want to seize control. It used to be that governments wanted to seize control of those things going on in space, but so much is now being discovered upon planet Earth that governments are acting quickly to secure and lock up certain areas that contain information that would rewrite all your histories and require tremendous thinking on the part of many. Wayne was asked the question, what is creating the magnetism at the Vostok site? There are huge crystals that are emitting certain types of magnetic emissions, and this creates the homing device. It's a similar type of energetic to that which is transpiring in Bimini, where the energy can draw into itself crafts and ship and sink them. It used to be that great spacecraft, not quite the size of a mothership, but of a cargo ship, would have equipment that would be lowered into this region on a magnetic beam, somewhat like a magnetic elevator. And from this region, the equipment would be dispersed as needed to other locations. These magnetic beams could transport heavy items to far distant places and energize those objects somewhat like the operation of a hoverplane. Not precisely the same, but similar. And this gives a little bit of insight into the construction of some of your pyramids and other massive edifices, such as the Great Sphinx. For this magnetic sonar system also can emit sound, both audible and silent. So you may ask, how can sound be silent? It's of a frequency beyond the range of the human ear, and so your Secret Service is wanting to harness this energy for their own purposes. They think it can be beamed to other objects in space. They also believe that it can be used as a weapon of destruction if need be. So they're hoping to reactivate this equipment in Antarctica. They'll not be allowed to do so beyond a certain point. Question to Wayne: is this magnetic anomaly and the entrance into the underground realm at this location related to Admiral Byrd's experience of going into the inner Earth? Yes, indeed, and when he did, he found himself in a totally different dimension, for these are also portal types of energies. The purpose of these great observatories, and they were much more than that, was to create time and space warp zones for the admitting of craft which were of a different frequency. With full knowledge of this equipment, a human could time travel and access information stored in many distant places. But you'll be prevented from doing so until governments have an arms treaty in place and become of a more peaceful state of being. Wayne, is this portal used today for entering, exiting craft that's been seen going up and down west coast of South America? This site was used as a refueling station. Many of the craft, especially the small ones, function from a magnetic standpoint, and it would work somewhat like the need to recharge a fuel cell in some of the vehicles you have now or refueling your electric cars. Many craft operate on magnetic energy systems, and these magnetic beams can serve to refuel or recharge many of these craft. The portal is not on the Earth plane, but is created in the atmosphere where it allows for admission of beings and craft from other dimensions. We've mentioned before that the nadial connectors are on the Earth plane, but they're also out in the galaxy as well. And these nadial connectors are also port entrances to access the next connecting point. When you connect with one of these nadial hubs, you then would follow a certain energy pattern to the next connector. Joshua P. Farrell pointed out in the very last section of his book, amateur German seismologists were picking up extraordinarily large, long waves, literally crawling all over their seismographs of the continent, almost as if something or someone was using the planet itself to broadcast something. And of course, he theorized in his speculations about the Great Pyramids that it utilizes precisely such longitudinal waveforms. An article in UFO News Group dated September 1997, a source said, "There are lines of magnetic force emanating from the South Magnetic Pole. What's strange about the North and South Poles is the way in which the magnetic lines of force move. The magnetic lines of force originate from a hole just off the coast of Antarctica. These are the Chilean and Peruvian scientists' bases being near or along the route of UFOs emanating from inside the Earth. Many UFOs fly directly south-north along South America. I could never quite reconcile that with the Antarctic, but if one draws a line from South America through the Antarctic bases of Chile, etc., through the South Pole to the South Magnetic Pole, then you get a straight line. What's interesting about this potential UFO route is that UFOs coming from inside the Earth would end up flying over the America South Pole base. However, the line of sight is such that the only places in the Antarctic where you'd stand a chance of seeing these UFOs is in the Weddell Sea area where South American countries have their bases and at the Scott base at the South Pole. The other parts of the UFO route is somewhat offset from the commonly traveled routes, and so there's little chance of running into UFOs by accident at any other places. That would explain why the US government doesn't like visitors to the South Pole base. It's not that the hole is at or near the South Pole base, as we originally thought, but along the route from the real hole in the oceans off the coast. Bob Barino, in his article, UFO Bases Found in Antarctica, Globe, January 18, 1983, quotes from certain scientists who believe that a subterranean UFO base is located beneath the strange Polinia Sea in the Antarctica's Weddell Sea region. Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd was an American naval officer specialized in feats of exploration. He was an expedition leader, explorer, and a pioneer in the field of aviation. He's probably the most famous account of all, considering its position. Operation High Jump was an expedition left solely under Byrd's command. It entailed a naval expedition to the Antarctic with a fleet of 5,000 U.S. military personnel and every resource he found need for. According to Byrd, who was only with his radio man in one of the planes, started to fly above warmer land where he began to experience radio loss and inaccurate compass readings. He claims to have flown over magnificent dwarf mountain ranges different from anything he'd ever seen, with great lakes and rivers. He saw mammoths and UFOs surrounding his plane. According to his testimonial, the flying disc-shaped vehicles took over his controls and disrupted his radio signals. They ushered him into a city and eventually landed his plane. This is where the story gets very strange. The master of the city invites him in for a conversation. He tells him about growing concern among his people of outer Earth's activities since the use of nuclear devices. Admiral Byrd's alleged diary was published by his son years after his death. This is where the following transaction between the master and he comes from. The dark ages that will come now for your race will cover the earth like a pall, but I believe that some of your race will live through the storm. Beyond that, I cannot say. We see at a great distance a new world stirring from the ruins of your race, seeking its lost and legendary treasures, and they'll be here, my son, safe in our keeping. When that time arrives, we shall come forward again to help revive your culture and your race. Perhaps by then you will have learned the futility of war and its strife, and after that time certain of your culture and science will be returned to your race to begin anew. You, my son, are to return to the surface world with this message. In 2016, a retired 60-year-old U.S. naval officer, first-class engineer, made disclosures on the extremely strange events happening in the Antarctic. Codenamed Brian S. explained how his C-130 crew encountered high strangeness from 1984 and 85 to 1987. The naval officer experienced and saw some very strange things down there, like a huge opening in the ice in a no-fly area, when they were crossing with a medical emergency on board. Then he ferried a group of scientists who had disappeared for 2 weeks, and has specifically been warned never to mention this subject again. As he put it, they looked scared. When they returned to McMurdo, their gear was isolated and they were flown back to Christchurch, New Zealand, in a special plane. The mysterious disappearance of these scientists is probably one of the reasons for the sudden mass evacuation of other scientists. According to Christchurch Antarctic Office, in 2014, the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research said it was not particularly useful to send hundreds of scientists to Antarctica. It would be not only cost-effective, but much more efficient to replace groups of scientists working in Antarctica by placing technology only, like sensors, to collect Antarctic data. A later report by the Council of Managers of the National Antarctic Programs, released in 2016, supported that view. Based on both reports, the international Antarctic community agreed and started to evacuate big groups of scientists working in Antarctica. With all the strange things happening in the Antarctic official statement, it is no doubt a cover-up. It's quite possible that they, like the naval officer, already saw and experienced what's really going on there. What about the visits of many people to high position? Kings, a prince, a head diplomat, a couple of highly placed Germans, an admiral, an astronaut, and an Orthodox patriarch have all visited the continent. Something's clearly going on, not the least of which is that word is getting around in high places, something requiring the scrutiny or at least the presence of such people. What might it be? Secretary Kerry's visit, and about Aldrin's, something or someone, and my bet is on something, has been found down there. Something probably very old, something perhaps very sophisticated, and something perhaps indicating a someone else, whether from here or just perhaps from elsewhere.